Putin lays waste city after city under attack as his forces close in. From Kharkiv in the north to Borodyanka on the outskirts of Kiev and to the southern port of Mariupol. Bombardment for hours where there are reportedly hundreds dead, and from where John Irvine and his team came face to face with the Russians in one of the last civilian convoys out.
At one point, the tank turret turned our way. We were staring down the barrel.
It has been 24 hours of horrifying escalation in the face of breathtaking defiance by the Ukrainians. But in the space of just 7 days, at least 2,000 men, women and children have lost their lives. They said never again in a Kiev bunker. One woman tells Rohit how she already survived the bombers of World War II. The pariah state, the UN votes overwhelmingly to condemn Russia, but will it make a scrap of difference? Emma's in Washington. One family's tragedy, a nation's agony. The brother of the little girl, Polina, killed in the fighting, also dies of his injuries. And Roman Abramovich puts Chelsea up for sale, promising the net proceeds to the war's victims.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. Towns in Ukraine that a week ago were bustling with life are tonight in places in ruins. It is death now that is everywhere. Tonight, a prosecutor from the International Criminal Court in the Netherlands has begun investigating possible war crimes. At least 2,000 Ukrainian civilians have now been killed, according to their government's figures, since the start of Russia's invasion. Places like Kharkiv, close to the Russian border, which we'll come to in a moment, and the port city of Mariupol in the southeast have been pounded by President Putin's artillery. Our ITV News team in the city joined one of the last civilian convoys out and saw Russian heavy armour heading in the opposite direction, an ominous portent of what is about to befall those still left in Mariupol.
Without electricity, water or fuel, we could no longer report from inside Mariupol, so we decided to join what would be the last convoy to escape. The city has a large Greek community, and Athens had tried to secure safe passage for a ragtag of Greek diplomats, citizens, and foreign journalists. With Mariupol just 5 miles behind us, tanks suddenly appeared in the mist. We hoped they were Ukrainian, but they were not. We filmed the Russians as surreptitiously as possible.
I can count 4 Russian tanks. Thankfully, the crews at the minute appear to be quite relaxed. Somebody from our lead vehicle has gone to have a chat to convince them that we are who we say we are, an innocent convoy leaving Mariupol for safety. You can see the Z on one side of one of the tanks. I can anyway. They're definitely Russians.
At one point, the tank turret turned our way.
Wow.
We were staring down the barrel. It's not clear what spooked them, but something definitely did. And suddenly, some of the Russian soldiers to the right and left of the tank were kneeling and aiming their rifles at our convoy. Thankfully, the situation eventually calmed down. They then checked our IDs, searched our vehicles, and allowed us to proceed. It took a while to drive through what turned out to be a large Russian armoured column.
Dozens and dozens of vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, tanks, lorries, hundreds of men.
Their presence confirmed that Mariupol is indeed encircled, and it's taking a pummeling. We were leaving behind a city where the deputy mayor claims Russian shelling today killed hundreds of civilians. To the Russian-speaking people of this region, it must feel as if these Russian soldiers are guilty of fratricide. John Irvine, News at 10, Eastern Ukraine.
Well, Russia today issued its first casualties figures since the invasion began. 7 days in, Moscow claims 498 of its soldiers have died in the fighting. According to our Ministry of Defence, Russia now has control of the shaded areas. American officials are still tracking that long Russian military convoy thought to be somewhere north of Kiev. In the south, as we've just heard from John there, in the port city of Mariupol, there have been many casualties following relentless Russian shelling. To the west, the Russian army claims it has taken control of Kherson. The Ukrainians say they haven't. And there's been intense fighting in Kharkiv, where Russian paratroopers have arrived.
For those familiar with Chechnya or Syria, this is very much the Russian way of war. City centres, here Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv. Of no military value, utterly devastated by indirect, indiscriminate fire. This a university building. Survivors pulled from the rubble who had no part in this fight. In Kharkiv, most are Russian speakers, the very people Putin preposterously claims to be liberating. Anna Paraskevova, who spoke to us on Skype, has lived through 7 days of this.
It's been hell, literal hell. So that's it. People are really frightened. People just lost pretty much everything. There was not much to begin with. We're not the richest folk here in Ukraine. My father lives also in Kharkiv. He's in another part of town. He lives there right now. So we just call him every time there's an explosion to ask him if he's alive, and that's it. I'm fine. Yeah, sorry. No crying. I'm all right.
If you wonder what life is like under bombardment in Kharkiv, watch this. He did survive this, but who knows how. Around Kiev, to both east and west, there are towns that Russia has decided to destroy in order to liberate. This is Borodyanka, that lies on the approaches to Kiev. And this Irpen, closer still to the capital. If this is now the plan, to use artillery and missiles to steamroll through residential areas towards the center of the city, then pity poor Kiev and what is coming. Maybe only peace talks can save it. President Zelensky's negotiators are still meeting the Russians, but he believes nothing can move forward without a ceasefire.
First of all, everybody has to stop fighting and to go to that point from where it was beginning. Yes, it began 6 days ago. And if those side is ready, it means that they are ready for the peace. If they don't ready, it means that you're just, wasting time.
While his army fights, his people are putting their bodies in the way of advancing Russian columns here in the southern town of Enerhodar, home to Europe's largest nuclear power station. And here in Starobilsk in the east, on the day the Ukrainian government says 2,000 civilians have already been killed, just how brave is this? This evening has been the turn of the southern city of Mariupol, holding out, but maybe not for much longer. This is an ugly, ugly war, and it's not nearly over yet. Kharkiv and Mariupol may soon fall, but these are two cities who 8 years ago, as rebellions swept the east, actively chose to stay with Ukraine. That was not a choice that Vladimir Putin was prepared to accept. James May's News at 10, Kiev.
Well, Dan Rivers is in Dnipro tonight and gave us his assessment of today's Russian bombardment a little earlier.
The shelling that you've seen in those reports in places like Kharkiv and Mariupol appears to be getting worse with every hour. Appalling loss of life, apparently. The Russians seem to be now tightening their grip on these cities, attempting to surround them and hit residential areas as well as institutions of the Ukrainian state. It appears they are also making some progress now in the east in terms of territory. They're very close to linking up around Mariupol, completely cutting off the city. The question will be, of course, how far they decide to push, whether they just come over towards the Dnieper River or whether they continue into western Ukraine. Odessa will be worth watching. They have already claimed to have taken the town of Kherson. Odessa is the third largest city in Ukraine and is preparing for a big fight. There are Russian naval frigates sitting off the coast, menacingly looking at that city, and everyone is wondering whether that will be the scene of the next big battle.
Dan in Dnipro speaking to us a bit early this evening. Well, tonight is the end of day 7 of the invasion. As every night for the past week, people in Kiev and in towns and cities in Russia's firing line are sleeping in one form of shelter or another. One of our ITV news teams in Kiev joined some of those taking refuge underground for the night and heard their fear of what the future holds.
We're beneath the silent streets of Kyiv. An underground shelter, a sanctuary, where there is no one way to respond. As troops inch closer above us.
I want ending this right now, because people dying and children dying. It is not right. I don't know why he doing it. He's crazy man, crazy and very, very sick man.
Midnight approaches. The children are still up. For them, war is just another strange thing happening on this strange day, but they're old enough to feel pride.
Flag Ukraine.
Their parents feel much more than just pride. A mother's lips tremble as she tells me how frightened she is. And that voice off camera?
Mom, не бойся.
That's her son beside her saying, "Mum, don't be afraid." Before bedtime, prayers for the Ukrainian soldiers defending the city. Putin's troops now just a few miles away.
У нас здесь в подземелье находится ребеночек, девочка, которой годик один. У меня прямо вопрос к Путину. Чем перед ним провинилось это невинное дитя? В церковном понятии это ангел. Чем оно провинилось перед Путиным, что оно должно проводить 5-й день здесь в подземелье?
Детей миллионы.
И таких миллионы по всей Украине детей, маленьких невинных. Это вопрос к нему, но вряд ли он ответит на этот вопрос.
Все.
Да, спаси Господи, я не могу.
Це наша земля, це наші діти, і ми маємо право жити в своїх домівках зі своїми рідними. І ці люди не повинні страждати всі. Угомоніться. Немає слів просто.
Тут осталося. І вийшло так, що розсоєдинили мене з дітьми.
Ми зараз всі так.
Despite her despair, Angela knows her heartache is just one story of one family in one city in Ukraine.
Morning.
They wake to find their city still under Ukrainian control.
Прячемся.
потому что бывают налеты.
Nadezhda is the eldest person staying in the bunker. She senses echoes of the Second World War. She has the memories from then and more.
Я, например, пережила уже сейчас вот это считаю Вторую войну. В 45-м году я в лесу пряталась. Или в погребе. И ногу перебили. И я до сих пор ощущаю.
The curfew is over. Some head home, some stay behind. Everyone knows the Russians are on their way. But here, the sirens can't be heard. The explosions can't be seen. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Kyiv.
Latest out of Ukraine's capital tonight. Well, President Putin doesn't appear to care what the rest of the world thinks, but at the United Nations, there was near overwhelming anger at what his forces are doing. Its General Assembly voted to condemn the invasion in the strongest possible terms, with 141 countries passing a resolution demanding that Russia stops the war and withdraws all of its troops. Well, Britain's permanent representative to the UN is Dame Barbara Woodward. I spoke to her just before we began tonight's News at 10, and my first question was whether today's vote will make any difference on the ground.
I think it does. It reinforces, I think, what is already happening in terms of military support to Ukraine, the economic sanctions on Russia, the humanitarian appeal which the UN ran yesterday, which raised $1.7 billion. But it also showed that the membership of the UN is resolute and steadfast in standing up for the principle of what we call territorial integrity, which is basically your borders are your borders.
But the bottom line is, on the ground, if you're a citizen of Mariupol today, it won't have made any difference, will it? It has not stopped this bloody pursuit of Vladimir Putin.
We haven't. And, you know, my heart goes out, as I know everyone's does, to the citizens of Mariupol, Kyiv, facing this appalling convoy of Russian armor approaching them, the citizens of Kharkiv who were bombed again overnight. One General Assembly resolution cannot stop that, but we are part of a collective effort to try and push back against this illegal invasion. And I think seeing 141 countries stand up in support of that resolution is a very strong message. And seeing only 4 countries really underlines how isolated Russia is now in the United Nations and around the world as a result of this illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Do you think you are dealing with a rational leader in Vladimir Putin?
I think it's hard to claim that any leader is rational who is flagrantly breaching the principles of the UN Charter in this way.
That's pretty strong language, really, particularly from a diplomat. So you fear you may be dealing with somebody who is not rational.
I think to breach the UN Charter for a P5 permanent member of the United Nations to invade illegally and without provocation another country with a view to taking it over and annihilating its existence is so fundamental to international law. And that's why the UK is among over 30 countries now who have asked the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to investigate the war crimes associated with this as well.
And you're in no doubt, presumably, at how dangerous a time this is for global security.
I'm in no doubt at all of the possible implications for global security. You're absolutely right. I'm here as the British ambassador to the United Nations. As everyone knows, the United Nations was founded to avert and prevent the scourge of war. And there have been echoes over the last 7 days of how close we have come again to the scourge of war that the United Nations was designed to prevent. We know that this is a defining moment for us all.
Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening. Thank you. Well, we can speak to Emma in Washington now. Good evening to you, Emma. The ambassador there pointing out, obviously the UN was designed to stop war, but in reality, how powerful is it at this moment?
Well, Julie, you only have to look at countries around the world, at the people living and dying in war zones, others who are struggling to survive the consequences of it, to realise just how difficult the United Nations has found it over all these decades to really stand by its founding principles and prosper peace. And rarely has it been so humiliated as it has been in the last week by Russia, a permanent member 7 days ago sitting there in the presidency hosting the debate over whether or not diplomacy could try and bring an end to the situation in Ukraine, whilst at the same time President Putin was carrying out his invasion. And it's for those kind of humiliations that the Ukrainian ambassador is asking that they are thrown from the United Nations Security Council, and that has been echoed by Congress here in the United States. Now, that isn't really possible under the rules of the United Nations because, of course, Russia can veto that. But they will try to look at the small print. However, ambassadors like Dame Barbara Woodward, who we heard from there, are much more concerned about the situation on the ground, what can be done to try and make things there better. And as an indication of just how global concern is being shared around the world about the potential for misstep, we heard from the United States this afternoon that they are pausing an intercontinental ballistic missile test because they are so concerned that it could be misconstrued or misunderstood with terrible consequence.
It is an extraordinarily nervous time, isn't it, Emma? Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, the pre-invasion intelligence suggested Russia would use light forces supported by ground-based rocket artillery. From Russia's point of view, things haven't gone according to plan. For over the past 48 hours, there appears to have been a shift in tactics, more artillery bombardment and the use of paratroopers on the ground.
A week into the ground assault on Ukraine, and the Russian tactics are growing more ruthless by the day. Artillery and cruise missiles are the weapons of choice, along with sporadic attempts to occupy territory with armoured columns. But Moscow is already facing fierce resistance, with Ukrainians defiant. And in this case, defenders armed with Western-supplied weapons appearing to bring down a Russian helicopter.
Yes! Yes, блядь! Два! Два!
One major question is whether President Putin has the agility to abandon a failing strategy. The Defense Secretary believes a pivot is already underway.
The Russians are changing their tactics. They realise their initial plan was a failure, and so what we see is nighttime bombing from the air because they are frightened of anti-air during the day. We've seen those massive bombardments and potentially encirclement rather than actually going into the cities where they know they'll lose thousands of soldiers.
The brutality shown 22 years ago in Grozny, in which vast swathes of the Chechen capital were destroyed, is a sign of just how ruthless Russian tactics can be. And some fear the same fate now awaits Ukrainian cities.
We will see the Russians surround areas of the city, issue warnings, and then they'll devastate areas, and anybody left in there will be assumed to be hostile. That's how they'll work.
In Syria more recently, Putin's campaign to support the Assad regime was almost based entirely on the Russian Air Force. It involved a relentless bombing strategy that showed no regard for civilian life. But so far in the Ukraine operation, perhaps uncertain of its control of the airspace, Moscow has not yet made full use of its bombers, although air assets are certainly visible on nearby military airfields. One of the great uncertainties is Russian troop morale, and whether this fratricidal war will lead to mass desertions. What is clear, though, is that the horror of what is being unleashed may only be just beginning. Robert Moore, News at 10.
Well, back to those who are facing that horror now. And by this evening, 500,000 long, tough journeys to safety had ended in Poland. There, it seems, the generosity and the ingenuity of the Poles knows no bounds, especially for Ukrainians needing medical care. In Korchowa, a shopping centre has been turned into a shelter, and makeshift medical clinics are offering a lifeline to as many people as they can. But there are those, children among them, who can't be helped without hospital-grade treatment.
What words can a mother use to comfort her 4-year-old child? They are safe from the bombs and the missiles, but her tiny body is being ravaged by cancer. And this makeshift medical centre in Korchowa cannot give her the treatment she needs.
We need help in Poland.
Martin Kutcher has been looking after her, but can't understand her documents.
We have Ukrainian papers and we don't know the history of her treatment. She needs to be treated in hospital. The hospital is about 400 kilometers from here.
The fragility of life is being protected in the most basic of ways. A small clinic set up only days ago in the middle of a shopping centre, in the midst of thousands.
This man has just come across the border and just been brought straight into this medical unit. Some of the medics here are working 24-hour shifts and then only having a 2-hour break before they come back again to treat as many people as they can.
Each family, each face had a life in Ukraine, a job, a home. Now they have this.
Now is 21st century and it couldn't be. Really, it's horrible.
Vera is 20 and was training to be a doctor. She had to leave her parents behind.
I think only about Ukraine. I don't think about what with me, only about my country, my president. He is the best president in the world. I'm proud of him so much.
But tonight, the elderly rest next to teenagers, and parents try any which way to get their children to sleep. This is not where they want to be.
I want to live in my country. I love my country. Ukraine is my home.
Julia is from near Kyiv. She doesn't know when she'll see her husband again. Her daughter Catherine is 11 months old.
My husband are military man. I don't afraid for me, but I'm afraid for my daughter and my husband. Half of my soul here and half of my soul there.
Here, mothers bravely play like all is well and hug like nothing has changed. But every day, Julia waits for her husband to message, "I'm alive." Lucy Watson, News at 10, Poland.
Well, that suffering and the loss of life among the children of Ukraine have perhaps been the most upsetting consequences of the invasion. On Saturday, a 10-year-old girl called Polina Kudrin was shot dead together with her parents as the family tried to escape from Kyiv. You might have seen her smiling in so much happier times out of newspaper front pages. Well, today, her little brother, who was also critically wounded, sadly died too.
They are joyous scenes familiar to any family anywhere. A day out in the countryside, a birthday celebrated, and a trip to the beach. But in the same car last weekend, this little boy, his parents and sisters took their final journey together. They are the family of 10-year-old Polina Kudrin, whose innocent smile was no protection from Vladimir Putin's war. Tonight, we learned that her brother, Semyon, has succumbed to his injuries too, from a hail of bullets that also killed his father, Anton, and mother, Svetlana, as they tried to escape Kyiv. They were driving to get out to their relatives. They were caught in the shooting. Oleg, a family friend, told us, "I know they're dead, but I'm overwhelmed. I cannot quite believe it." Semyon was 7, an ordinary child, with ordinary hopes and ordinary dreams, whose life was ended by a horror beyond boyish imagination. He was just a kid, says Oleg. He was curious about everything. He had so much potential, so much to look forward to. His oldest sister, Sophia, is in hospital. She doesn't yet know she's the family's sole survivor. Russia claims it is not attacking civilians, but in Ukraine they know that death is indiscriminate. John Ray, News at 10.
And finally tonight, the owner of Chelsea Football Club, Roman Abramovich, has been trying to distance himself from President Putin and the sanctions against the president's supporters. Well, this evening he decided to put the club, the reigning European champions, up for sale for £3 billion. He says he hasn't done anything to merit sanctions, and he said he's going to donate any profit he makes to the victims of the Ukraine war.
Undoubtedly Britain's best-known oligarch, Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea 19 years ago and his billions turned them into a football superpower. But since Russia launched its invasion, his links to the Putin regime have led to growing calls for him to be sanctioned, culminating in the Commons today. Appropriately watched by the Ukrainian ambassador, a guest of honour who was given a heartfelt welcome.
Mr. Speaker, Roman Abramovich is the owner of Chelsea Football Club and various other high-value assets in the United Kingdom. He's a person of interest to the Home Office because of his links to the Russian state and his public association with corrupt activity and practices.
Mr. Speaker, it's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases. By sanctioning 275 individuals, already a further 100 last week, the impact is being felt.
Abramovich said tonight he did not want loans of £1.5 billion repaid and added, "I have instructed my team to set up a charitable foundation where all net proceeds from the sale will be donated. The foundation will be for the benefit of all victims of the war in Ukraine."
The only statement I want to hear from him is, President Putin, take your tanks back home, stop the war, stop the carnage, de-escalate, stop this now. The people of Ukraine have a perfect right to their own sovereign country.
Chelsea were in action tonight in the FA Cup, during which pro-Ukrainian chants were heard throughout the game. But what if the sale hasn't gone through before Abramovich is sanctioned and his assets are effectively frozen?
Expression of intent to do something is not going to be good enough. You would be caught out by that situation. So I would have thought that if anybody is thinking of liquidating their assets, they would be wanting to do that sooner rather than later.
The club that has relied on a largely silent Russian benefactor without asking too many questions now faces an unknown future, as does Abramovich himself. Steve Scott, News at 10.
And that's it from us for tonight. The people of Ukraine brace for more difficult hours ahead. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.